So for the next 2 years, the World Bank expects for the Thai economy a quite drawn out. However, the country that fared worse was the Philippines. Thailand didn't do as bad as some neighboring countries.
As we know, since last year, GDPs in all countries around the world are affected from COVID-19 crisis. So let's focus on Thailand first. How does the World Bank estimate GDP in 2021 and 2022?
Thank you so much again for giving us the opportunity at the World Bank to provide you our growth forecast for Thailand. So for the next 2 years, the World Bank expects for the Thai economy a quite drawn out and uneven recovery, and levels of output would not return to pre-COVID levels until 2022. In 2021, the World Bank projects growth at 2.2%. And if COVID is not contained and the infection rate is still expanding in quarter three, the World Bank's downside scenario would become more likely, and that expects 1.2% growth this year in 2021. In 2022, we hope for a stronger rebound and project 5.1% growth. And this is based on the assumption that there is first solid progress on the domestic vaccination program, second, an improvement in the global trajectory of COVID-19, sufficient to allow international tourism to partially recover, and third, that the recently approved additional 500 billion Thai baht financing package is fully dispersed and potentially boosting GDP by around 1.5 percentage points. Overall, we expect that goods exports and the ongoing rollout of fiscal support measures, the main and important drivers of economic activity for Thailand in the coming years. However, like with all forecasts at this time, risks to growth remain skewed to the downside, and the outlook remains fundamentally uncertain. And that is not just true for Thailand, but for all countries we are working in.
As a World Bank country manager for Thailand, what positive or negative signs do you see now that you need to keep an eye on?
The following. First, the vaccination rates of the country as a whole. So the path to achieving immunity across the population is still uncertain, and it relies on many factors, such as the implementation of the COVID-19 vaccination plan, the success of vaccine procurement, the effectiveness of vaccines against new strains of the coronavirus, and the extent of vaccines take-up and delivery among the general population. And second, a premature withdrawal of fiscal support measures that are still very strong at present would also result in a more drawn-out economic recovery and could have really significant impact on the most vulnerable segments of the population. And it is really paramount that efficient implementation of the relief and recovery measures remains a key priority of the government. And third, supply and logistical bottlenecks could impede Thailand's ability to fully benefit from the recovery in global trade that is already ongoing. So over the medium term, lasting scars from the crisis in the form of reduced accumulation of physical and human capital could inhibit the recovery of potential output to pre-pandemic levels in the coming years. On the other hand, and I want to finish on a positive note, there are also upside risks from a more robust global recovery that could result in opportunities for improved trade and foreign direct investment.
Could you please give some details on how COVID-19 impact microeconomic and macroeconomic in Thailand, and how does it differ from the rest of the world?
Yes, let me please reflect specifically on the impact of the very recent waves of COVID-19 in Thailand. And I think we can all agree that if this COVID-19 outbreak continues, this would have further adverse implications for Thailand's economic outlook. But what we've observed is that the number of new COVID cases per day has increased tenfold from April, despite the restriction measures imposed in July. And economic activity continued to be negatively affected by the third and fourth COVID waves. And it is expected that it deteriorated significantly in August due to the partial lockdown that needed to be imposed. And the impact of rising number of new cases and falling local mobility is weighing especially on household consumption and some services sectors. So the partial lockdown imposed on the 29 provinces, which account for about 80% of GDP in August, implies that private consumption may worsen further in this third quarter. And consumer confidence fell already to a record low in July. And we also saw, as you know, domestic tourism plunging since May, when hotel occupancy rates decreased to around 5%. Another important aspect is the speed of the vaccine rollout. So the number of people vaccinated with at least one dose is 25% at the moment, while only 7% of the population have been fully vaccinated. And these are the numbers, I think, of August 15. So the vaccine rollout has reached on average 260,000 per day over the past month. This means that it could take almost a year to fully vaccinate 70% of the population. So by mid-2022. This pace is similar to the countries like Indonesia and the Philippines. While if we look at the Malaysia strategy, it would take Malaysia less than 2 months to fully vaccinate 70% of its population at their current. And let me close by reflecting on export performance, which has surpassed already pre-COVID-19 levels since December 2020. And this was supported by the recovering demand in major trading partners and the upward trends of the global electronics cycle. However, the export growth rate has been slower for Thailand than for some other regional peers. And this is partly due to the smaller share of electronics and electrical exports, which have seen a significant recovery for other Asian countries due to the strong global demand.
How do you compare specifically Thailand and ASEAN? Which country recovers the fastest and which country is the slowest?
So if you look at the GDP growth for Thailand last year in 2020, it was minus 6.1%, which was one of the lowest in the regions. However, the country that fared worse was the Philippines with minus 9.6%. And originally, when COVID hit last year, the World Bank projected that Thailand would be very hard hit. But in the end, Philippines fared the worst because of the severity of the COVID impact in the Philippines. And also in the Philippines, the response dimension and cash handouts were much slower than expected, and hence the lower GDP growth there. But one important point here is to look at the delta or the change from one year to the other. And here you can also see that the Philippines had a larger delta while growing around 6% before COVID hit and then dropping to minus 9.6%. Thailand was growing at 2.3% in 2019 and then dropped last year to minus 6.1%. So it is still a large change for Thailand, but it is not as large as, for instance, the Philippines. And interestingly, Malaysia's growth declined in 2020 by minus 5.6%. It is not as big as Thailand, but if you look again at the GDP growth before COVID, it was 4.3%. So the change of 2020 to Q4 is close to 10 percentage points, which is larger than Thailand's change of about 8%. And this is really due to COVID infection rate per million population, which has been higher and continued during a much longer period in Malaysia than in Thailand. And it was for that reason that Malaysia needed to implement more severe lockdown and movement measures, as you know. And also their cash handout response was much slower than in Thailand. So in terms of delta or change to before COVID, Thailand didn't do as bad as some neighboring countries, but still Thailand was very exposed, especially in terms of tourism. And COVID still had a large impact in 2020 and will continue so to have that impact into 2020 before we hope that Thailand's output will return to its pre-COVID levels.
How can policies be strengthened to support Thailand's poor and vulnerable groups?
Yes, we all know that the economic shock associated with COVID-19 has severely affected employment, income, and poverty. But the Thai government really responded very quickly and has mitigated much of its impact. And it should be really commended for this achievement. And just recently, the government announced more relief to support households' demands during the third and fourth COVID waves. This includes the 298 million Thai baht, which is about 2% of GDP, of fiscal relief since the beginning of the third wave in April. And we all know the spending is being funded from the remaining 1 trillion baht borrowing decree and the new 500 billion baht borrowing decree, the government budget, and the social security fund. And the measures are quite wide-ranged and include co-payment schemes, the 10 to 15% cashback from purchasing goods and services, compensation to affected workers and firms in the 13 provinces under lockdown in July, as well as subsidies for school and university students. And the simulation we did at the World Bank demonstrated that in the absence of government's relief measures, the headcount poverty rate for Thailand would have increased by over 6% in 2019 to 7.4% in 2020. And if you would have not have all these measures that the government put in place last year, you would have an additional 700,000 people in Thailand falling below the poverty line. And we see that between the social assistance and social insurance schemes, over 44 million Thais have now directly benefited or have been compensated to some degree through these relief measures. And preliminary estimates suggest that more than 80% of households in Thailand received social assistance during 2020. So it's a great achievement. But of course, while this COVID-19 social assistance response was impressive in many ways, Thailand can further strengthen its social protection system going forward. And that could be done by investing in effective targeting that ensures that really the most vulnerable beneficiaries receive adequate support, and defining and tracking the minimum and maximum packages of benefits that households may receive to limit the overall fiscal burden. And finally, incorporating the large informal sector that was already done very well in the last relief measures in 2020, so that ultimately everyone can receive the needed support at all times and not just only during these crisis periods.
Thank you for today. I think we have more information about the overall of GDP in this year and next year also. So thank you very much for being here. ขอบคุณค่ะ